Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Kids Talk Church History. Kids Talk Church History is a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer on Kids Talk Church History, a podcast in partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals.
About 300 years ago, some thinkers in Europe started to question many teachings that are found in the Bible. They believed that people had just been following the Bible out of habit without using their reason. Today, we call this period of time the Enlightenment. Stay with us as we discover what these thinkers taught and what happened next here at Kids Talk Church History. I'm Emma. I'm 17 years old, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I am Grace. I am 13 years old, and I also live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I'm Sean. I am 14 years old and I live in Augusta, Kansas. Why is it called the Enlightenment?
I think it's because these thinkers thought they were bringing light to people's minds. They asked questions and tested their answers and ideas instead of just accepting them.
How do you test an idea? I mean, if it's a scientific theory, I can see how you can do that. But what about an idea about life in general?
I think they just debated their ideas to see which ones really made sense.
I can see a problem for Christians then because so many of the things we believe were just taught by God in the Bible or by Jesus when he was here in person. We can't really test them as you would test a scientific theory.
These thinkers remind me a little bit of Descartes. Remember that episode? He wanted to test everything too. He started by doubting everything, even his own existence, and then tried to figure things out with his reason.
Yes, and the way he knew he existed is because he could think. So he said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
So he put his reason at the center of his investigations.
Yes, he relied on reason. But Christians rely on God's word first, or revelation. That's why many Enlightenment thinkers criticized Christianity and other religions. They thought they were just superstitions.
Who were some of these thinkers?
So one of them was Voltaire, a French author. One of his big questions was, how can a good God allow catastrophes and wars? When an earthquake followed by a tsunami killed at least 10,000 people in Portugal, he published a book criticizing those who said that some evil is necessary to bring out the good. He thought there was just too much evil. He ended by saying that we have to live well and do good to others.
I hear many people saying the same thing today. There are even people who say they believe in God, but that God has left everything up to us.
Yes, I think the problem with evil in the world is a really big one. Some people think that God is good but limits his powers because he wants to give us freedom.
And it's easy to go from there to saying that there is no God at all, because a God who creates a world and then leaves it to itself is not very helpful.
Yes, I think we call those people deists.
Who else was important during the Enlightenment?
There was Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. He said something similar to Voltaire because he thought that Christianity was basically a set of rules for acting well, and that the important thing was the moral law inside of us.
What if I can't hear this moral law?
I know there are so many jokes with his name. I've heard someone say Immanuel Kant, but at least Immanuel tried.
Or why did the students fail the philosophy class? Because they can't understand it.
We probably shouldn't make fun of people's names.
Maybe. Well, at least we're not saying anything bad about him.
Oh, I've heard of another philosopher of the Enlightenment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
I'm guessing he was French.
Yes, and he believed that human beings are born good. If someone grew up alone in a forest, he said, he would never learn to envy others or take what they have.
Well, that seems easy because there's no one else to envy or rob.
We probably don't agree with most of what these philosophers said, but it's good to know about them because they had a huge impact on the way people think today, even in some churches. So we have here a great expert to help us, Dr. Michael Lee, professor of early American history and the chair of the history department at Eastern University. His bio on his university's website says that he's a specialist in modern Western intellectual history, meaning that his research focuses on the history of philosophers and ideas as opposed to kings and wars. So that's exactly what we need. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, and that little intro was pretty fantastic. You did a great job.
So You heard us talking a little bit about the Enlightenment. We usually just go by what we read in our church history book. Did we get anything wrong, or is there anything we should add?
No, I thought that was a very good summary. It was very well done.
Wonderful. So we call this period the Enlightenment, but what were people calling it then?
Well, at the time, as you would imagine, we have this impression because we read history books that it just turned 1700 and a bunch of smart people woke up one day and decided, yes, we're in the Enlightenment team. And they always had you almost imagine that they had little cards that showed them what club they're in. But it was a gradual, like all intellectual movements, it's something that emerges slowly. It's kind of like I'm not sure if you guys still have Polaroids, those photos. There's something there, but over time, it becomes more clear. And only in retrospect, we realize it was a movement. Yeah. So at the time, they were associated with another, but they didn't really have a label yet. We hear historically, though, we sort of trace back the term enlightenment to you mentioned Immanuel Kant. In 1784, he wrote an essay when he was a young guy called "What is Enlightenment?" or in German, "Was ist Aufklärung?" And essentially, it's very similar to what you already said. He had this essay that we have to wake up. We've been living like children, and we're being stupid on purpose. He's taking the principles of the scientific revolution, which is questioning the past, questioning all inherited ideas that we've gotten so far, and challenging everything, putting everything through a meat grinder or a coffee filter, and only testing everything through reason, rigorous questioning, and empirical evidence. And that's what it means to be enlightened. Okay, so even though he wrote this very famous essay, Was ist Aufklärung, it's not like after they read the essay, people start calling themselves Aufklärung people or enlightenment. It's probably really in the early 1800s that we see the term enlightenment, or rather the phrase age of enlightenment, as a distinct historical epoch in the early 1800s. And I would say maybe by the middle to the late 1800s in English, in the English-speaking world, it's commonly accepted, about 100 years ago, yes, there was a thing called the Age of Enlightenment. So it took a while for people to actually recognize there was a movement after the fact.
Yeah. So some people say that the Protestant Reformation opened the door to the Enlightenment. Is there any truth in that?
Yes and no. I think on the one hand, let's be clear, if Luther and Calvin saw what happened in the 1800s, they would flip out and they would disown everything. So on the one hand, we don't want to say that the Reformation led to the Enlightenment, and yet it kind of did. Let's go back to Martin Luther, the Diet of Worms in 1521, which I know probably a lot of your listeners know about. That's a time when he had to make the famous line, "Here I stand, I could do no other." So, I mean, let's just say some of the distinctive feature of the Enlightenment is, say, thinking for yourself, be guided primarily by reason and evidence. I mean, I think really the thing about the Enlightenment is the idea that you're liberated from the past, liberated from hierarchical authority, liberated from, say, like communal knowledge, and liberated from institutional knowledge. But rather, you're gonna be like a scientist and overturn potentially everything you've ever learned before, and have an open mind to learn new things. Okay, so Luther, I can make the long story short here, but during the Reformation, he's questioning a lot of inherited ideas like salvation, penance, repentance, a lot of inherited ideas from Catholicism. And so, to make a long story short, he kind of hides himself away. He reads the Bible with the best original manuscripts that he can in Hebrew and in Greek. And what does that sound like to you? That it kind of sounds a little like Descartes. Remember? I mean, Descartes has this idea that he's going to hide away and annihilate all other ideas he might have once had, just think on his own until he gets to the truth. In a similar kind of way, Luther's doing something like that. He's supposed to say, I want to forget everything I've learned before. I just want to read the original sources and through it. And later on, he's going to face the Catholic Church. And he's facing like a millennia of authority. He's facing layers and layers of hierarchical authority. He's facing communal consensus. And they say, the entire Catholic Church is saying, Martin, you're wrong. You're wrong. And he says, no, I'm right. Here I stand, I can do no other, because I've thought through this. I've read the original sources. I have a different idea. And even if everyone says I'm wrong, I believe I'm right because I'm thinking about it all my own. I mean, you can see some similarity with what Martin Luther is doing and what Immanuel Kant will talk about later on as don't be a child. Think for yourself. Be rebellious if you have to. Be bold and courageous, even if you have to stand all by yourself. So in some ways, I think there's something in the spirit of Luther which you could say trickles down and perhaps informs the Enlightenment. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. But not necessarily like the ideas as ideas are related. Is that accurate?
I think the idea there's a similarity to the ideas. I
Mhm.
mean, it's hard to prove causality,
Mhm.
but I think in a very inadvertent kind of trickle down kind of way, I think there is some causality.
Okay.
This idea of rupturing tradition, challenging the infallibility of
Mhm.
inherited ideas.
Yeah.
It's not direct, but I
Mhm.
think there's something of the spirit of the Enlightenment that Luther is maybe the great great grandfather
Yeah.
of the Enlightenment. I think you can make that claim. It's hard to prove.
Okay. Well, to follow up on Kant, I hear a lot of people saying that romantic philosophy is the total opposite of the Enlightenment. But what about philosophers like Kant and Rousseau who believed that very similar things to what the Romantics believed? Can you explain what Romanticism is and whether it really is opposite to the Enlightenment?
That is a fabulous question. It's fascinating, and we could do 10 podcasts on that question alone. So I'm going to be really challenged to keep this limited. In some sense, let's take Rousseau. I really think Rousseau is a man at a time. I mean, except for the fact that Rousseau lived in the 1700s, he really intellectually belongs as a romantic philosopher. So he's just way ahead of his time.
Hmm.
Um, Immanuel Kant, I mean, okay, let me put it this way. In some ways, let me put it this way. The Enlightenment is in many ways the opposite of romantic philosophy, and yet at the same time, they are related. I used to put, this is a funny way I like trying to put it. I think of the Enlightenment as a very responsible father who lives in the suburbs. You know, he's an accountant or engineer. You know, he wakes up at the same time every day, drives a minivan, very, very responsible. You know, he's very logical, reasonable, wants to do everything in a completely rational kind of way. And I think of Romanticism as a rebellious son of the Enlightenment engineer accountant father who decides he wants to get a mohawk, get tattoos, and start a punk rock band in his garage. I think what happened was, one could argue that the Enlightenment so focused reason and logic and evidence. It's maybe true, but it's a suffocating way to live. And I think what happened is the next generation just got sick of it. And they emphasize emotion, passion, feeling, love, and desire. They were into not where the Enlightenment is in many ways, if you're going to say that the whole world's logical and reasonable and you want to use science and mathematics as your basis, there is a strong sense of, on the one hand, rebellion against the past, but conformity towards how the world ought to be. But what that does is stifles out your individual exceptionalism, right? And it's highly conformist and has no room for the irrational, the passionate, the emotional, or just doing something crazy or going by your feeling. And so romanticism is in many ways a rebellion against the Enlightenment. We have a bunch of people who just say, I don't care if it doesn't make sense. I will do that which I love. And I will become the person I want to be because I have this deep burning desire within me, which is very not Enlightenment. However, how are they related? Well, in some sense, I mean, Enlightenment is a rebellion against the past and this idea that all ideas from God. But instead, their new God is order, reason, and logic and evidence. Romanticism is a swing, but it's not going towards God anymore. It's not a rebellion that where they want to go back to where they used to come from. But now the new locus of authority is the heart, the subjective feeling, and individual ideas. So in some sense, they're related. They're both rebellious, but they're fighting another locus of authority.
But I guess both of them are very turned inward. You have like more Enlightenment thinking where it's like turned inward on the reason, like
Yeah,
I can just logic my way, where then Romanticism is like I can just feel my way, as opposed to looking outside of the self. Would that be
that's a
kind of
very
how
good way
they're related?
to oversimplify, but it's still true. I think maybe the pre-Enlightenment person said the locus of authority is God and tradition.
Hmm.
The Enlightenment person says, no, the locus of authority is my brain.
Hmm.
The Romantic person says, no, the locus of authority is my heart.
Hmm.
However, there is a difference between the Enlightenment and Romanticism. In the Enlightenment, though, the locus is not just your brain, but it's like your brain is not purely subjective. It's like math. I mean, we can all do math, but we're gonna get the right answer,
Hmm.
you know, if we're doing it the right way. The artist, imagine a math class. We're gonna figure out this equation. By the end of the class, we should all get the right number, or someone's wrong. And when you're wrong, we're just going to talk to you and teach you until you say, ah, yeah, that's right. The answer is 5. I see now. Thank you. I want you to imagine an art class, a modern art class, and we're all going to paint an apple together. It'll be really weird if all 30 students painted the exact same apple in the exact same way, you know? Everyone's going to have a slightly different interpretation. They're going to put themselves into the painting of the apple. And if the fact that they're all different is probably a good thing, you know, because we're all being subjective and you're putting your individual spin and interpretation into what you're painting. So that's one difference, though. But you're right, though. I mean, the way you phrase it is true, but I would tweak it a little bit.
Mhm.
Is it true that philosophers during the Enlightenment looked down on the Middle Ages and they called it the Dark Ages? Why did they do that?
Okay, this is true. The idea of the Dark Ages actually began during the Renaissance. Those Italians found a Petrarch who coined the term the Dark Ages. And for him, it's because of the Renaissance, as you probably know already, was a return to the classical age. So for a guy like Petrarch, that became kind of a common idea. The Romans, especially the Greeks, were full of light, culture, beauty, and art. And then this horrible Middle Ages happened where it's all just dark, a decline. And it really was a big decline. And then the Renaissance is rediscovering the age of light, going back to the classics. So that's why they call that middle area the Dark Ages. So, I mean, that argument actually would be of the Renaissance, the Dark Ages. However, the Enlightenment people also called the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, but for a different reason. Petrarch and during the Renaissance, they're all mostly Catholic and still pretty religious. So what they hated about the Middle Ages was not the fact they're religious, but the fact that there was a real decline in culture, decline in literature, decline in beauty, decline in the sophistication of art. For the Enlightenment people, they call the Middle Ages dark because it was an age of faith. It was a world in which church dominated and theology was the queen of the sciences. And for them, the age of faith is the opposite of the age of reason. So it was dark because it was religious.
Even though we consider as Christians that our Christianity is light, people back then were thinking it was darkness.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't agree with these guys, but yes, I mean, some of the more radical Enlightenment people who would have called the Dark Ages would have hated it because it was so religious, and they thought religion stifles the intellect, which I don't agree with, and neither do you, I'm sure. But that's what they were thinking.
How did the Enlightenment influence the church?
That's a really great question. Again, we have 10 podcasts on that one. So let me see if I can make this as short as possible. We keep talking about this guy, Immanuel Kant, all right? So let me see if I can walk us through this. Kant is most famous, I believe, for saying that there are two things in the universe, the noumena and the phenomena. The noumena is a thing itself. The phenomena is a perception of the thing, right? So people used to think that, let's say I'm walking through the woods and I see a big, beautiful tree, right? I see brown bark, green leaves, tall, massive, beautiful tree. People used to think I perceive the tree because that is a tree. I see the green leaves because there really are green leaves. Okay, that's a way that most people, and that's the way almost everyone else thinks about the world. Immanuel Kant wants to say, no, actually, there is a thing out there called the noumena, except you're getting sensory input through your brain and I mean through your eyeballs and ears and nose. You're just getting some kind of input. And what your brain does is it's constructing your impression of the world. It's like your brain is taking in data and you're like in a movie theater and your brain is projecting a movie onto your brain. Except we actually don't know what a tree is. There's something there, but we actually don't know what green is. It may or may not be. We only see green because your brain has created the idea of green that you're interpreting. So your brain is actually an active, creative agent. It's not passive. It's making an idea in your head. So he ultimately says we will never have access to the noumena. All we have access is a phenomena. You follow so far? Okay, so that's a radically different way of understanding how we understand the world. Okay, so Immanuel Kant's really extremely influential for the Enlightenment. Years later, there's a guy named Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's a theologian who picks up on a lot of Immanuel Kant's ideas. So Friedrich Schleiermacher would say, okay, so we don't really know the thing itself. We only know the perception. So his big thing is, he says, the heart of theology, the heart of religion is this feeling of absolute dependence. It's a feeling of radical dependence upon God. So, I mean, let's put it this way. Imagine you're walking through the woods, and you're having a good day. It's a beautiful day. And you go through the woods and you see this massive, beautiful waterfall, something like Niagara Falls. I mean, you're in the woods and no one's been there before. You're hiking and you're the first guy there. Anyway, then you have this feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm a tiny gnat. I'm nothing. And God is huge. Okay. That's that feeling of absolute dependence. It's a feeling. Okay. So, and he says, so theology for him is not really God itself, but my experience of God. And later on, the generation after Schleiermacher would say, the Bible, it used to be understood that the Bible is like this revelation, God's gift to us, straight from God to you. It's inspired, it's written by human authors, but from God to you. Later on, other theologians using Immanuel Kant, then Schleiermacher, would say, actually, all the Bible is really people who experience God in their own subjective, different personal ways. So then theology for people like Schleiermacher and what we call liberal theology is not the study of God, but the study of various people who have experienced God. And remember I said before about the whole art class, everyone's going to draw the apple in a different kind of way. And that's just fantastic. There's no perfect way to draw an apple. That's a romantic view of art. Well, a romantic view of theology will be, there's no perfect way to describe God. In fact, according to Kant, we'll never know God. We just have the phenomena, not the noumena. So the best we can do is sort of study many, 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 many different subjective and variegated different experiences of God. And that's real religion. But I don't believe that, though, because I'm Orthodox conservative. But that would be the way Enlightenment and Romanticism has affected the church and religion.
How much of the Enlightenment lives on in what most people believe today?
I'm a Christian, so I'm talking about generally speaking. So I don't buy into this, but I would say people often say, if you look at history books, the Enlightenment starts in 1700 and ends in 1800, and Romanticism picks up in 1800 and ends around 1840. I would say the Enlightenment started in 1700 and never ended. It just never ended. And I could go on and on about this, but functionally speaking, we're still living the Enlightenment. Let me give you one example. Like most people would say science is authoritative, right? If I tell you something like, I really feel like this food's good for you, I really feel it, They would say, well, that's nice. You might be right. But if I can put out if I can bring out some people with lab coats and test tubes and Bunsen burners and show you lots and lots of numbers of charts, of like, yeah, I believe that food's good for you. We trust science. I think a lot of people believe there might be a spiritual world out there. There might be angels. There might be God. There might be things they love, beauty, morality. But ultimately, what really matters is like matter, molecules, meat, solid stuff. I think in these ways we're still living with the Enlightenment. I think someone already mentioned this before, but I think if you're not a Christian, most people, I don't know too many atheists. I know a lot of people who aren't Christian, but I don't know too many atheists. So if you ask them, so what do you believe about religion or God? Are you spiritual? People say something, well, I believe there's probably a God. Most likely there is. And they believe in basic morality. Like, no, you probably shouldn't steal, probably shouldn't murder, probably shouldn't cheat, probably shouldn't like blow up a town for fun. And then you ask them, well, how do you know these things? They'll say, well, I can kind of feel it in me. It just makes sense. It's intuitive. And there's a God. But they really go on beyond that. They just describe deism. I think the vast majority of modern people in the West are deists. They just don't say it. I think the vast majority of people are materialists. They're not denying there's a God or a spiritual realm, but for the most part, they highly prioritize just the material reality of the world, which is, again, a very enlightened way of looking at things.
Was there anyone at that time who contested the ideas of the Enlightenment?
Yes. There was this guy named Edmund Burke. You may or may not have heard of him. He wrote a book called Reflections of the Revolution of France. And basically, he was actually really prophetic. He looked at what was the beginning of the French Revolution and thought, he's an Englishman, by the way. He thought, you guys are nuts. You cannot invent the world from zero and just start all over through reason. You've got to honor tradition. You can change, but you got to change slowly and gradually. You can't destroy things unless there's a really, really good reason for it, and just go very gradually. And so he kind of called, he was famous because he said he kind of predicted the reign of terror would happen, and it did. So a guy named Edmund Burke is not anti-change, just pro-tradition, and say proceed with caution. I would say Rousseau is again, he's romantic out of place, and for him, he'll say, look, passion is important, feeling's important, desire is important. It's not all just reason. And again, the Romantic era was so close to the Enlightenment era, but I think, as I said before, I think the Romantic era is a giant rebuke of the Enlightenment, saying you've gone too far.
I have read on your university's website that the question at the heart of your studies is, why do individuals and cultures abandon religion? I'm kind of curious to know. Can you give us a quick answer?
No, I cannot, but I'll try. I think ultimately there is a sense in which you abandon God because you can, and we are sinful beings. That's sort of a very quick answer, but I mean, I think part of it is it begins with the Enlightenment. You know, we in some what the Enlightenment does is it liberates us from God. Scientific revolution has created a world in which actually don't need God anymore. We have material answers for many, many things. Romanticism makes the world deeply subjective, and we're like in some ways idolizing our own desires, our own goals. So in many ways, I think we abandon God because I think in the heart, I mean, this is more theological, but deep down inside, we're all rebellious. We all have a sinful nature. We desire not to be submitted to God. It's only by the grace of God that we do learn to understand that it's better to be under God's order. But I mean, I think people abandon God because they want to. And when the structures that limit our desires are somewhat loosened or removed, we give into those. Not all the time, but that's a human tendency. So I would love to go on and on and on, but that could be a very short answer, given the time that we're running out of time.
Here are two questions that we ask most of our guests. First, how did you become interested in the history of ideas?
Okay. This was I actually remember the exact moment. I was a freshman in college. I went to Yale, and I was taking a class called European Intellectual History. I had no idea what that was. I just wandered in because it sounded kind of interesting. And I remember in the very third or second lecture, the professor was it was a massive lecture hall, but he was giving a lecture on this very topic, the Enlightenment and how that turned into Romanticism. And I remember sitting in the classroom, and I had no idea what I would do when I would grow up. I was just in college, but it had to be college, and I wanted to learn. But I wasn't thinking about profession. And I remember at that moment, I mean, I wish I had the date. It was like the third class of the class on European intellectual history. I thought, this is it. I want to be that guy when I grow up. And so it was really that class that did it. Yeah, but in some ways, I feel like that class was a culmination of many ideas I've been developing ever since high school.
Second question, if you could meet anyone from the time of the Enlightenment, who would it be?
Okay, actually, there are two. I'm going to cheat. One is John Locke, and one is Jonathan Edwards. I'll do Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards is, I'm sure you've heard of him. He's like the last Puritan living in New England, and he's like this freaky genius savant. And what he's doing is he's just getting all these books. This is before the internet. He just had to buy books coming in crates from Europe, and he's devouring Enlightenment books. And as a Puritan, he's like totally, his whole education was not Enlightenment, it was medieval. But he's reading all these radical Enlightenment thinkers, thinking to himself, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But in my image of him, though, you can use the metaphor, it's almost like he realized we Puritans we're like the Titanic. We're on a boat. And this Enlightenment thing I see over the horizon, it's an iceberg. This is not what he said. This is my take on him. And he realizes if we just keep going this way, we're done. Theology needs to be we don't change orthodoxy, but we need to reimagine the way we do theology. So what he did in his lifetime was trying to take in what he could from the Enlightenment and in some ways stay powerfully orthodox, but reimagine how we do orthodoxy in light of these radical revolutions happening in Europe called the Enlightenment. And he's a fascinating figure. So that's one person I would like to meet.
Dr. Lee, we are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And listeners, be sure to check out our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, and let us know what you think of these episodes and keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals and on behalf of my co-hosts, Grace and Sean, I am Emma. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.